The next great figure of the age of faith and reason we want to think through is the great Christian saint Augustine. Augustine was born very close to the time that Boethius was, and in ways they have a similar background. They were both educated and immersed in the classics, philosophy, rhetoric, and they both, again, wrote works that were to exercise an enormous influence in terms of their substance and in terms of their style throughout the Middle Ages. I think it's fair to say that Augustine is the most influential philosopher, especially Christian philosopher and theologian from the early Middle Ages, and his influence is still felt today. Let's say something about the circumstances of his birth and his intellectual development. So Augustine was born to a Christian mother and a pagan father. He himself was taken up with rhetoric, with poetry, and didn't really express any real religious leanings until later on in his life. At the point that he begins thinking about philosophy and religion more deeply, he becomes beholden to the sect of the Manichees. He falls under the spell of the Manichees. So I'm going to say a little something about what the Manichees believed and how it shaped his early thought. The Manichees were a Gnostic sect that understood the world in terms of a kind of fundamental duality, a metaphysical and a moral duality between matter and spirit. So there are two sorts of fundamentally divisive warring principles, spirit and matter, and they're to be judged or valued in polar opposite terms. That which is material is subpar. It's intrinsically bad in some way, and that which is spiritual is intrinsically good. We ourselves are fundamentally spiritual, but trapped in the physical body, and many of our actions, our choices, and much of our conduct can be chalked up to our physical natures in the sense that our physical natures imprison us and determine us to do things that are evil, right? And so you can't really see yourself as being either free or morally responsible for your behavior as you are embodied. It's through this duality, this dualistic philosophy, that you're able to make sense of the conflicts, the inner conflicts that we experience, and of the phenomenon of evil. So Augustine remains under the spell of this Manichaean outlook for some time. But over time, he becomes more and more disenchanted with it. He feels that he begins to grow up, and he thinks that the psychological analysis and the analysis concerning the freedom of the will and of good and evil on offer in this Gnostic sect is ultimately unsatisfying. And he sort of switches over to a kind of more Neoplatonic orientation. So this Neoplatonic orientation still sees the world as dual in the same way that Plato did. So you've got the realm of the forms, you've got these intelligible items, souls, immaterial objects such as those, and you've got the physical world. But there is a fundamental unity running through these. Reality is dual, but also unified, because everything emanates from what the Neoplatonists called the one, or the good. So as you can see later on, when Augustine becomes a Christian, it's very easy for him to draw a connection or an identification of the Neoplatonic one with God, the Christian God. But we're still back in the Neoplatonic stage for a little while, and this is what, according to Augustine in his book, The Confessions, sort of softens up the beach for Christianity. It's the philosophy that paves the way for his conversion, his acceptance of the Christian religion. So when Augustine emerges as a Christian, he does battle right away with the Manichees, whom he had been a member of before. And he writes a book called On the Freedom of the Will, where he attempts to disprove the Manichaean outlook on things and to defend the idea that human beings are not intrinsically bad. So his Christianity won't allow him to look at the body or the physical nature as being something that is intrinsically bad. To the contrary, you are made good. Human nature is good. However, as we'll see, human nature, given the circumstances in which it's born now, after the fall of Adam and Eve, is born in a corrupted or kind of misaligned condition. But before he gets into this development of this doctrine of original sin, he defends the idea of the freedom of the will against the Manichees. And in this important work, he says, look, your actions, your behavior, all of that is not determined by a physical nature which is itself beholden to physical laws. To the contrary, your body is under the control of your will, which is something spiritual. And in fact, the bad choices that we make emanate not from your physical nature, but a free choice to turn the will towards mutable goods, but in a way that is inordinate. So you turn towards the transitory goods of the world and turn your back on the supreme, immutable good, which is God. That is what sin and evil fundamentally consists in for Augustine. Now, as he progresses and as his philosophy develops, he thinks of the will in more and more qualified ways. That is to say, he thinks of the freedom of the will in a more and more qualified way. So remember, for the ancient philosophers, such as Aristotle and Plato, freedom of the will was understood in an intellectualist vein. So you remember, the reason is supposed to exercise control over the passions and the bodily desires and so forth. And a free individual is almost identical with an individual that exercises self-control. One of the problems that this intellectualist view of the will had was that it was very difficult to account for certain psychological phenomena, such as the phenomena of self-deception and weakness of will. You know, it's a part of our experience that we succumb to temptation and do things that we know we ought not to do, that aren't good for us in the long run. It's very hard to understand how that could be if the intellect is fundamentally leading and driving the will, if the will just does whatever the intellect says is good. And so Plato famously said, well, there can't really be such a thing as weakness of will. All sin or vicious behavior can be chalked up to ignorance. You really didn't know any better. Now, Augustine can't accept this because it's part of his own psychological experience that, of course, sometimes we go against what we know to be best for us overall. And if you chalk up all bad activity or all good activity to just following judgments of the intellect, you can't really make sense of moral responsibility in a Christian framework. So as Augustine's philosophy continues to develop, in particular his philosophy of the will and his anthropology, what you see is a movement away from the intellectualist origins of the notion of the will to what's been come to be called voluntarism. So on the voluntaristic picture, what you've got is a theory according to which the will has a degree of independence from the intellect, and indeed exercises a degree of influence over the intellect. So this allows then us to explain those puzzling psychological phenomena of weakness of will or self-deception and the like. And it also paves the way for Augustine's theory of original sin. So on this theory, because of the fall from grace, because of the sin of Adam and Eve, we are all born in a sort of corrupted or subpar condition in which our wills are directed away from the true good and are desirous of things that are harmful to us. And this sort of bent in or misalignment of the will can also have an effect on our reason, on the way that we think. Now, because of this, the notion that the will is free, that we're free to do as we will, comes under more and more scrutiny. And in fact, Augustine says because of original sin, because of the voluntaristic shape of the will, our knowledge of the true and the good, and our desire to conform ourselves to the true and the good is something that is, in a real sense, out of our hands, in the sense that it's not something that we can pull off on our own. Without divine assistance in the form of active grace, the human being is going to be lost in ignorance and inevitably drawn into sin, and therefore away from its highest supreme good, which is the beatific vision, the knowledge and the love of God. So what you've got now is a picture which leaves the human being free to sin in a particular sense, but not free to not sin. Okay, so the formulation he gives as a part of his anthropology, which leads into his philosophy of history, is that when Adam and Eve were created, humankind in its original state had the ability to sin, but also had the ability to not sin, could have maintained rectitude of will for its own sake, as Anselm would later put it. But since the fall, in this post-lapsarian condition, human beings are not able to not sin. That doesn't mean in any particular instance you were determined or necessitated to sin. You still do it freely in that instance, but it is inevitable that you will sin, you will fall away in your life. You're lost and in need of aid. That aid has got to come in the form of divine grace. When divine grace acts upon you, through cooperation with it throughout your life, you are led finally to a state of redemption in which the roles have finally reversed, and not only are you able to not sin, but you're not able to sin anymore. So it's through this long process involving divine grace and the cooperation over time of the individual that you are led to a state which is higher and better than the original state of humanity, and which in fact involves something like a divinization, a sort of deification of the individual will, because your moral liberty mirrors the freedom that God himself has. It's a freedom of perfection to always know, to always do the true, the good. Okay. So how does this then fit into his overall outlook on history? I want to say something about that in reference to Augustine's famous work called The City of God, because it's in this work that we see the very first philosophy of history ever developed in Western intellectual history. According to Augustine, the world is divided up into the people who have responded, who have been preordained to respond to divine grace in such a way that they come to love God. Their driving motive is love of God. On the other hand, the people who have been passed over for this kind of effective divine assistance are left in their sin and are never able on their own steam to attain the beatific vision, to attain the supreme happiness for which they are made. These people are characterized not by a motivation to love God, but they're characterized by a love of self and a love of mutable transitory goods that take them away from their highest and eternal good. The people in the former category are people who populate the city of God. The people in the latter category are citizens of the city of man. Why does he divide the world up into these two categories? Why does he develop this picture of sort of global human destiny, along with the account he gives of individual human destiny earlier on? Well, what occasioned the writing of the book, City of God, was the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, so as is well known, Constantine converted to Christianity in living memory early on in the 300s, and not only converted to Christianity, and not only legalized Christianity, but made the Christian religion the sort of official religion of the empire. So remember, from a Christian perspective, this has got to look right. This has got to look like what should be expected. Because when Jesus comes on the scene, remember he says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of God is upon you. That we should pray for this kingdom to come on earth as in heaven. So they were expecting a transformation of the world along Christian principles, which would usher in the sort of benevolent sovereign rule and reign of God on earth. It's very easy then to identify the Holy Roman Empire with precisely this kingdom of heaven that Jesus had announced. And it looks, on the one hand, from a Christian perspective, like the kingdom of heaven is falling apart, right? With the falling apart, with the sacking of Rome. On the other hand, it gave fodder to the enemies of Christianity who said, see, look what's happened. We've left the old gods, we've left the old ways, we've endorsed this newfangled religion, and now our whole society is being blown apart. It's crumbling round about us. So Augustine writes The City of God in part to defend Christianity against his critics. He says, no, it's not the new religion that caused the fall of Rome. It's the old sins that caused the fall of Rome and the corruption that has finally caught up with it. And he offers an analysis of the city of God and the city of man, which in effect says, look, the city of God is realized in worldly societies or people groups all throughout history, beginning with righteous Abel, with Seth, with that godly line, and all the way up to today. But it can't be identified with any particular human society. And in particular, it can't be identified with the Roman society or the Empire of Rome. So it isn't the fault of Christianity that the Roman Empire is collapsing, nor does it mean that Christianity is collapsing along with the Roman Empire. So it gives us a way of analyzing the ebbs and flows of human history, the involvement of the kingdom of heaven within that history, which brings about a transformative effect, but without identifying that kingdom with any particular political or social organization or structure. So Augustine's framework allows us to see a way of understanding human destiny, which takes what Augustine sees as the very best of ancient wisdom, especially along Neoplatonic lines, the best of ancient ethics, but it's reworked and redirected towards a Christian eschatology, a Christian linear view of history, and an identification of our supreme good and our ultimate happiness in the Christian God, who is the one who predestines individual people to come to this ultimate happiness and allows others to fall away from it.